Right, it's about 5:30. It's my very great pleasure to welcome you all here tonight to listen to Professor Frank van Veen's inaugural lecture on discovering, understanding and conserving biodiversity. I'd like to say I know and understand Frank's work, but I'm a cultural theorist, so there's a bit of a gap between our subjects. But when I said to Frank, is there anything he'd like me to say? He said, no, just keep it short and breezy. But I'm not going to do that, but I will respect some of Frank's wishes. I want to say a few things, at least, about Frank and his work. Because Frank, as most of you will know, he joined the university back in 2009 as a senior lecturer in the Centre for Ecology and Conservation. And very recently, he's jumped over to the Centre for Geography and Environmental Science. And you're a really valued and welcome colleague and highly regarded within our department. And we're delighted to have him, which is great for us. And so over that time, so obviously I've been here during the same period. Frank and I've recognised Frank obviously, but I didn't really know him at all. And we've been having some coffees recently and just having a chat. So I've got to know something of the person as well as asking about what do you do, which is the obvious thing for somebody in your department. So I do want to say a few things about that. And there's things that have really struck me. Frank can come across as a very laid-back kind of Dutch person, very straight. I like that about the Dutch. They will tell you straight to your face what they think. It's a good quality, actually. But behind that, there's a ferocious intellect, and just talking, we kind of kick ideas around, and you realise, that it's not just about this subject matter, but Frank has a wide range of views and opinions and ideas on different aspects of academia and interests. And that intellect is represented in the excellence of his papers. And just go and look at them and where they are, and think about the grants that Frank has won as well. Again, they're from the places that you would like to win grants from. So that's great. Second thing I've really noticed with Frank is that he has an absolute passion for what he does. It's driven by an intellectual curiosity. Now, I shouldn't really be surprised that Frank is driven, because I've heard him telling these tales about being an endurance skater when he was younger. I mean, seriously long distances, skating across frozen canals and lakes, to mad bonkers canoeing around the coast of Cornwall. I think he's canoed around the Isles of Scilly. Absolutely incredible things. To playing in a band, all those things take passion as well as that endurance. And finally, Frank strikes me as somebody who has a tremendous empathy, not only for the object of his study, but for the people he works with, those communities. He's often found himself. I think in the blurb it said from English meadows to Bornean forests. And I'm kind of interesting when Frank tells me about being isolated in the middle of nowhere and then ending up drinking some very hard alcohol that's been brewed locally. You realise to do the work he does, it takes tremendous effort, but also to have that empathetic feeling for the subject matter and the complexity of those ecological networks that he studies. And as a geographer, that's when I I get very interested. So, I'm really looking forward to the talk tonight, and it's my very, very great pleasure now to pass over to Frank. So, thank you, Frank.
Yeah, thank you, Mike. Hope that's all true. Well, it turns out to be more or less accurate. Thank you all for coming. Brilliant to see you all here. It would have been slightly less fun if it had been an empty room, I suppose. Welcome to everyone online as well. I can't see you, but thanks for joining us as well. And yeah, it's quite hard when people ask you for your title for your inaugural. The honest title would have been stuff I've been up to over the years. But you've got to come up with something that kind of more or less covers the load, and I think this probably kind of does it, I suppose. And I also want to say, thanks to my son Alfie for this photo that he took of me a few years ago. not at all acted or anything. Right, so yeah. That doesn't work. That doesn't work. Right. That's right. Fierce intellect and all of that. There we go. Worked it out. So I mean, it's always good to start. And so inaugurals come in different forms. So in the Netherlands, where I'm from, they've got a very fixed format where you have to look forward. You can't do a retrospective of what you've done. 20 minutes of looking forward, no visual aids. That's it. Whereas the English or the British version is much more of the Life Scientific on Radio 4, that kind of version. I toyed with shall I go the Dutch version? I soon decided, no, that's not what I'm going to do. I don't think anyone would forgive me if I did. It's a lot more fun to kind of look back a little bit. So yeah, so we'll start with the origins. Where are you from? Kind of trying to figure out where the inspiration came from to become a naturalist, a natural historian. Well, I mean, I grew up in the west of the Netherlands, the bit that is actually called Holland. Which you see here, and it's just basically a big urban sprawl. It's known as the Randstad, which is the edge city or something. So it's Rotterdam in the south, and Amsterdam up there, The Hague on the coast, Utrecht to the east, and all the suburban sprawl in between. It's just one big suburban area or urban area. With what green there is in between is intensive agriculture with livestock and flowers. Not a lot there to inspire a young natural historian, basically. And I was born and grew up right in the middle of that, in a little town called Voorschoten, right in that block of flats over there in a typical 1960s council estate. It was quite a nice place to grow up, lots of space to run around on the grass. But all pretty sterile. Again, not quite clear what inspired me to have an interest in natural history. But I found myself drawn to a lot of the water that you get around the canals. That's the only place really where you find any biodiversity in this landscape. And why I was drawn to it, I don't know. But from a young age, there was no one that encouraged me, but from a young age, I found myself poking around in the canals with or without a fishing rod, and it wasn't just about catching fish; it was about the wonder of discovery and all of that. I remember that very much. Yeah, so that's what I spent a lot of my time doing. And when I wasn't doing that, I was in the public library, going through reading every book on animals, and then once I read them all, it started again. Obviously, there was no internet. I'm not that young. And then, yeah, and watching every natural history or wildlife program on TV that I could catch, especially by this character Jacques Cousteau. He used to travel the oceans with his ship, the Calypso, go to exotic, remote places and make wonderful discoveries about wildlife and natural history, diving on coral reefs and. I liked that. That's what I wanted to do, basically. But it wasn't, not really obvious how you go about making a career out of that, really. People, like I didn't go to university. I didn't really get on with school very well, I have to say. I had a bad stutter, autistic, even though I didn't know it at the time. But all of that meant I obviously could learn well, but not in the way that people wanted me to learn. So my journey through school was a bit convoluted and took a bit longer than it might have done otherwise. But nevertheless, along the way, I got the idea that going to university is an option, and to university I went. It didn't work out so well to start with. I had to start again after 2 years. But I got there in the end, and I was studying biology, and I was loving it, and I found my feet. And by the time I got to, so this was a 4-year degree, like an integrated master's. By the time I got to the third year, so the third or fourth year, we got to do research projects, and this is where I really found my calling, if you like. And so the first project that I did also led to my first scientific publication. So I thought I'd spend a minute looking at that. And so this was a project on fish from Lake Victoria in Africa. So this is the largest tropical lake in the world. It's huge. And it was home to about 500 species of fish that occur nowhere else, and they're all very closely related to each other. And all of them, many of them, highly specialized. One of them eats only snails, another eats only scrapes algae or a particular type of algae from a particular type of rock. Others eat only the scales of other species, or even the eyes of other species. So they're all like really specialized. And so big question here is really where does all this diversity come from, and why isn't there just not like a couple of just generalist feeders? Why are there this great diversity of specialist things? So I looked at this in this project by comparing some species that fed on insects in the water column, which means that they have to suck them out, because if you just open the mouth and swim onto it, you push it away with the viscosity of the water. And ones that feed on snails. So these were closely related species. And the snail eaters had these big jaws in their throat, the pharyngeal jaws. Yeah, they're used for crushing snails. Whereas the ones that suck things out of the water column have these smaller jaws in their throat, but they have this really intricate system of sucking in water, which I won't explain. I could be here for hours. Basically, what we found out was that intricate system could only work with a certain configuration of the skeleton of the head. We built cardboard models of this, and it was great fun. And you can't have this configuration and have these big jaws in your throat. So you can only either eat snails or insects in the water column. You can't do both. To get the adaptation for one type of food, you can no longer eat the other type of food. So this was kind of the explanation for why there is so much, for these particular species, why there's so much diversity here in these things. So yeah, so this led to a publication. This was the title of my project, and so the people I worked with on that project published this paper. And they forgot to put my name on it. That was disappointing. But they shortly after published another paper that used a little bit of my data as well. So to make up for that, they put my name on that paper, but they got my initials wrong. So that was a great start to my publishing career. For my next project, I was working on parasitoid wasps. These are insects that you may be aware of, you may not be aware of. You should be aware of them, because they are probably the most diverse group of animals on Earth. There's an estimated 1 million species of them. Nearly all of them, apart from a few that are a bit weird, they have the same kind of biology where they lay an egg inside an invertebrate host, and that egg then hatches into a larva. The larva eats its host from the inside, living host. So it's like a parasite, but unlike a parasite, it kills its host in the end, and it bursts out of it, and a new parasitoid comes out of that host. So the parallel that people always make is with the alien from the movie Alien, right, bursting out of it. That's what parasitoids are like. And so yeah, so parasitoids are hugely diverse. People always go on about how diverse beetles are. There's about 500,000 species of beetles. You know, they don't even come close to the parasitoids. So, come in. Yeah, and so they vary in size from like tiny little things of like a fraction of a millimeter to big things like this tarantula hawk, which parasitizes tarantulas. And so there's huge diversity. And I did a project on these things. We're working on the behavior, the foraging behavior of them. Lots of intricate experiments, really tedious, but I really loved the whole process of coming up with hypotheses, thinking about ideas and hypotheses, and then designing experiments to test them, and having the data come in, and then finding out they were all wrong, and throwing up new questions, designing new experiments. I loved that. And so it was obvious to me that, the next step, I wanted to do a career in science. I wanted to carry on doing this. And to do that, you have to go and do a PhD. That's the only way through, well, I know of. And so, the problem was at this time, when you were a young man in the Netherlands at the time, you had to go and do military service, 18 months. So as soon as, before I even graduated, I got my papers, call up for infantry service. for 18 months, including 6 months in Bosnia, where with UN peacekeeping forces, where things were really kicking off at the time. That this was not a great prospect. It took, I think, like 3 months of convincing them that I needed a new medical examination, and then they finally gave me one, and it turned out I was half deaf in one ear, and I was out. That was lucky. But in the meantime, so there had been a possibility to carry on with a PhD, to carry on from my undergraduate work and to go into a PhD. But in the meantime, while all this military service stuff was going on, that opportunity had disappeared. So I was just, I applied for PhD positions here, there, and everywhere. I got the interviews because I'd done really quite well in my degree in the end. I got the interviews, but they were all car crashes, basically. I didn't get anywhere. So I soon found out I had to make my own luck. And I started, and long story short, I applied for an EU grant, a Marie Curie fellowship to go to the UK to do a PhD, and I applied for some Swiss grants to go there. And then, as these things happen, suddenly everything came together, and I got all 3 of them. And I had to choose, but yeah. So obviously, I came to the UK to do a PhD. I came to Imperial College, London, but we were based in a campus outside London in Silwood Park, Ascot, next to the race course. A bit of a weird part of the world, if I'm honest. And I was working with a man called Charles Godfrey. And actually, so funny enough, so talking about parasitoid wasps, last night in the pub, where's Richard? There he is. Richard, last night in the pub, said, did you hear this episode of The Life Scientific about this guy who was the world expert on these microscopic parasitic wasps? And I thought, who could that be? So I looked it up this morning. It was my supervisor, Charles Godfrey, of course. He is not the world expert on microscopic parasitic wasps. He is not. He maybe at one point might have been on one particular little group, as I became on another particular little group. But yeah, that aside, so that was quite funny, listening to my supervisor on the radio. He's now Sir Charles, of course. But anyway, yeah, so the PhD, that was about, so up until then, population ecology, or up until kind of that around that time, had really been focused on kind of predators and prey, like one species of predator, one species of prey, or one host species with one species of parasitoid, to try to work out how population dynamics of species work, why numbers of individuals of a species fluctuate over time. What Charles was really developing in his research group was a study of networks of whole communities that are all connected through these networks of interactions, and how all that context affects the dynamics of the species within it. And so they started up a program of studying this network as a model system for studying these kind of processes of aphids, so sap-feeding insects, the parasitoid wasps that feed on them. So each of these blocks here is a species in one meadow, and the width of the block is the kind of the population size of them. When they started gathering data on this from this one meadow, they found that there were all these other little things that came out, which were parasitoids of the parasitoids. So this, like, imagine the alien bursting out of the man's body, then there's another alien bursting out of the alien. That's the guys in red at the top. And unlike the green ones and the blue ones, very, very little was really known about those hyperparasitoids, as we call them. So that was my job, was to figure out what the hell was going on with those hyperparasitoids. And the most important thing that we didn't know about them, whether there were just a few species that each parasitized lots of host species, or whether there were maybe many species, each of them highly specialized. Because it was pretty hard to tell them apart. When these insects evolve to a small size, what they do is they lose all identifying characteristics, the nice little ridges that they got on them and all of that. And so this was tricky, but so I spent an awful lot of time staring on the microscope at thousands of these little things. And I could tell them apart in the end on kind of small, subtle differences, the ones that came from different hosts. But this is all quite subjective. You don't know whether they look different because they grew up in a different species of host, or because they are genetically different, actually different species. So the only way to figure that one out is to have an objective method. And this was really in the kind of the pioneering days of doing DNA sequencing and applying it to ecology. And so I had this is when DNA sequencing was still hard. You had to, you had to follow recipes. You had to make up your own buffers, your own reagents, and all of that. None of these kits that you can buy now. It's all too easy now for these kits. But yeah. So this is my excuse for it. It took me quite a long time to get to get the DNA data. But so it got it to work again. I worked out a method also for. So selected a particular gene, and it all worked very well, and found clear differences between the species, and also worked out a method for actually calculating the probability for finding the differences that we found if these were not different species, essentially. So we could actually put a number to it, how certain we are that these are different species. So that is the objective method that we needed to actually separate out this network. And it turned out that the answer is there are loads of species that are often highly specialized rather than just a few generalists. So much like those fish from Lake Victoria. And the lesson I learned from that, I suppose, as well, is that if you want to go and find new diversity, because quite a few of these were new species, new to science, the ones that we found. When we started, there were 16 species known in the UK. We found about 40 in that one meadow in the southeast of England. So the lesson I learned from that is that you don't have to go to remote, exotic places to find, to make new discoveries about biodiversity. You just have to get down on your knees in a soggy field in the southeast of England and look at the small stuff in the undergrowth that no one else has looked at yet. And there's still loads to discover there in terms of biodiversity. So that was fun. So I wanted to carry on with my career in science, but I'd finished my PhD, and I applied for postdoctoral research positions. A few more car crash interviews followed, and I found myself a year in the wilderness of working in call centers. It paid quite well if you had like I did, if you could speak a few languages. The money was okay, but I mean it was hell, I can tell you that. So I was absolutely over the moon when Sir Charles, as he is now, got another grant to carry on his work on studying this aphid parasite food web, and offered me the job of running the project. And this is really what we were trying to do here is really we had 5 years of data of this network already, of monthly population densities of these things, of all of the species in it and all the interactions. It was a very unique data set. What we had to do now is get another 5 years data, which meant that I spent half the year full-time in the field counting aphids and collecting parasitized aphids. And the other half of the year, I sat behind a microscope identifying parasitoids that had come out of the samples. I think I identified about 30,000 individual tiny little parasitoids and the aphid host that they come out of. That was quite hard work. And the idea was that we could study the dynamics of this whole system and could work out whether species that were linked to each other via 2, 3, 4 links, whether they were affecting each other's dynamics from looking at the parallel time series of population sizes from them. This turned out to be way beyond my statistical and mathematical skill set. It's a really hard problem to crack. But so I started this in 2000, I think. A few years ago, we finally got to work with some very clever people in Japan who cracked the maths of it. And we finally got the first paper out that actually looked at these parallel dynamics. And we found that, yes, there are. So we're finding that the dynamics can explain a lot by the direct interactions, but we also find a lot of species that are dynamically linked that do not have direct interactions. So these must be caused by these indirect effects, essentially. Long story short, there's a lot more work to do on this. I think that this will keep me busy until I retire. in addition to that, we're trying to pick apart what's going on in this network by taking small bits out of it and doing experiments with something a bit more manageable than this big network. And so, so put together these small communities consisting of just one plant, broad bean plants, and 2 species of aphid and 1 species of peristoid that attacked only one of those aphids. And we ran experiments with that in the lab in small perspex cages, and you know, they can all coexist nicely over many generations, as long as you just keep feeding them a few more bean plants occasionally. So it turned out if you eliminated either that aphid there, then the host and the peristoid, the other aphid and his peristoid, would go extinct. Their dynamics would go all over the place, and they would crash. There were good reasons for that. Basically, what it comes down to is that you have a system like that, it can all coexist nicely, but you remove any of the elements from it, and the rest of it cannot coexist anymore. It falls apart. And that kind of raised the question of so when you have extinctions happening in ecosystems due to human activities like overharvesting, overfishing, whatever, so you remove one species from an ecosystem, it can have repercussions for the wider ecosystem. It could lead to secondary extinctions. And so this led on to a whole research program, a series of experiments that I did together with Dirk Sanders, who worked as a postdoc with me on this. Like I said, it was a whole series of experiments. I won't talk you through all of them, but basically to show that we can set up these communities of multiple species of aphids and peristoids, and then start harvesting one of those peristoids to try and drive it extinct. Often we even fail to drive it before we'd even managed to drive it extinct. Other species would start, that we hadn't touched at all, would start going extinct. And often what would happen is that our action would lead to the extinction of one species, that then in turn would lead to the extinction of others. So you get this kind of domino effect happening. And in this last paper of that series, we demonstrated that. So this is where we made it as complex as we possibly could. We had a grant to do this all in a larger scale with these mesh cages in the field here on campus. So we had 40 of those, so we could set up nicely replicated experiments. And these more complex communities, including hyperperistoids, which we did not intend, but they're impossible to keep out. They always make their way into our experiments, and in a way they made it better and more realistic. But the main takeaway message from this was that when we had more complex networks, they were more resilient to these cascading extinctions. You could lose species from that without it causing the collapse of the whole community. But once you got down to the bare bones, the simplified community, then removing one species led to the collapse of the whole thing, essentially. So yeah, what that really means is that as you're eroding biodiversity in the world, you might get away with it for a while until you hit that point where you're just dealing with the bare bones, and then one more loss can lead to these kind of domino effects of cascading extinctions. Doom and gloom for you there. Meanwhile, I moved to Cornwall here. Actually, I spent 9 years working after my PhD, so not 9 years working at Imperial College. Made my way here, never regretted that move. While I was here, so someone walked off the street into my office saying, hi, I'm from South Africa. I'm here on sabbatical with my partner who's working as a GP, looking for collaborators, and had a little chat with her. And we bounced some ideas around. We looked at funding opportunities. We applied for an EU grant. And before we knew it, we had a project running in South Africa. That's kind of, in a nutshell, how it happened. And this project was based around agricultural systems that exist in the landscape that is mostly wilderness. So this is in the northeast corner of South Africa near Kruger National Park. It's mostly, well, a lot of even the bits that aren't national park are often private game reserves. So there's a lot of wild areas around, or wildish areas around non-cultivated areas. And the farmers there that were farming mangoes within that landscape, they were convinced that a lot of their pest problems were coming because all this wild vegetation around is a source of all the pests coming in. It's a reservoir of all the pests coming into their crops. And so we argued, but it's not just pests, there'll be pollinating insects as well. There'll also be natural enemies of the pests. So there could be ecosystem services, but also ecosystem disservices with the pest movement. And so the project was really about trying to find out what the balance between those two things was. And the way that the funding worked is that we had money basically to exchange postgraduate students. So I was sending groups of master students over there to do field work. We had French partners involved as well in Paris, so they would send groups of master students out there. And then we had South African students that also go and do field work there, and they would come here to analyze their stuff. It was great fun. We must have had between 20 and 30 students working on this project and working together in the field, and then us as supervisors would go and we'd go over there and check that they're doing all right, and off we go on safari in Kruger Park. So it was a good gig. It was a good gig, but the science was good fun as well. So these are some of the pests. So fruit flies that affect the mangoes. There were these gall flies that affect the leaves, and there was this flower malformation disease that turns the flowers into broccoli, which means that they don't set fruit, which was spread by mites. Long story short, we found basically that these pests, that the control of these pests was really facilitated by the natural vegetation. So natural enemies were coming out of the natural vegetation. So as you moved away from the natural vegetation into the crops, you found that the pest problem always got worse. And this was true both for the fruit flies and for the flower malformation disease, because the mites that spread it were controlled by ants, and those ants were being knocked out by pesticides in the center. There was basically no habitat for them in the center of the farms. Also, one of our South Africans, so this was a paper that was done by a PhD student of mine, Tom Henry, plus MSc students. And we also had this South African master student who showed that the fruit flies, which were the main pest, they were not coming from the wild area into the farms. It was all going the opposite direction, basically. And once you were like a kilometer away from the farms, you could not find any of these fruit flies in the natural fruits. So it was pretty clear that there's no ecosystem disservice. There was only services, really, in terms of the pest control. And another of the South African students, Lave, she looked at the pollinators and through this web. What you can tell from this, so each of these little lines here is a species of insect that found feeding on the flowers of the mango, a potential pollinator. What an enormous diversity of insects there is really there. And the bottom row those are the big block is the mango, all the other ones are wild plants. And those wild plants are really essential for maintaining this whole community of pollinating insects year round, because the mango flowers are only about for like a few months of the year. But those populations need to be maintained year round, of course, and in the environment. So that's so this really kind of showed how reliant the crop is on the natural vegetation for maintaining the populations of pollinators that the crop also relies on. So that was that. At the same time, moving across to Borneo now. At the same time, I was starting work in Borneo. The way that came about was that my department said we want a field course somewhere in the tropics, and I said I'll take one to Borneo, and all right, that was it. That was it essentially. I had never been anywhere near a place like that. That didn't seem to be a barrier. I had the idea, so what you need to know about Borneo, some basic facts. Sorry, so it sits there between Southeast Asia and Australia, right on the equator. So it's tropical as it gets, really, and it's big. It's like 3.5 times the size of Great Britain. Northwest corner of it is Malaysian or British colonies, and the rest of the other 3/4 are Indonesian, Dutch colonies. And so, you know, I knew other people, other universities that ran field courses. They all went to Malaysia, all went to the same places. The easy thing was to copy what they did, basically. But yeah, I didn't do the easy thing. I got to talk to some other people who convinced me that the Indonesian part is much more interesting. There's much more forest, much less research has happened, lots of undiscovered stuff. And, you know, that's really where the work still has to happen. So why go to Malaysia where it's all been done already, rather than, yeah, I was convinced. So we ran these expedition style or expedition field courses in remote places in Borneo. Hilarious fun. Nothing ever went wrong. We never lost a single student. It was great. That's how I ended up there, basically. Did that for 7 years, I think. But in that time, it was got to know people there, got to work with, got to interact with, kind of by accident, with an NGO called Borneo Nature Foundation. They weren't called that to start with, but that's what they became. We were working in the south of Borneo, and yeah, started to do researchy things together. And this started out, so yeah, working in the south here, in the lowlands, and so the area that we work is kind of around here, and so you know, this blob of green here is the Savannah National Park, about 6,000 square kilometers. It's got a big place. That's protected forest, swampy forest, and then to the east of that is this large deforested area. That's the Mega Rise project. I'll talk a little bit about that in a bit. And then to the north, there's this big blob of forest. I think it's about 1,500 kilometers square of totally unprotected forest, of forest types that no one has really kind of looked at very much. Because in the south, you've got the peat swamp forest. In the north, in the mountains, you got the mountain and the hill forest, but the stuff in between, in the lowlands here, is this kind of heath forest on sandy soils. Most people ignore it because it's got low productivity, probably quite low diversity, not so much conservation value, possibly. And BNF invited me to some expeditions in there that had been instigated by local communities who wanted to protect their forest and wanted, you know, more research to be done there to kind of get it on the conservation map. So I jumped at that opportunity. This figure just shows you, so this is a figure from a PhD thesis by Sherry Mang, who worked with me on this project. And this figure just shows in this landscape kind of how unprotected it is. There's all the bits here that have either dashes or dots in it or whatever. These are different land use concessions made to various companies, so either for mining or for conversion to oil palm or conversion to acacia plantations for paper pulp. And so that covers most of that landscape. So at the moment, most of these have not yet been converted. They're still forest. So there is still hope. But this is why it's so important to get these places on the map, right? To actually do the biodiversity research and actually to know what is actually there in that forest. There's biodiversity research at its most basic, essentially. So you know, we did a bunch of expeditions there with a bunch of people, and we had fantastic times. This was like, you know, spending a month in the forest, living in very basic conditions. And working really hard and getting really soggy and very smelly. And then for some people that would be a nightmare. For some people, like, you know, just living the dream, basically. It really was. And so, but anyway, yeah, so those expeditions annual expeditions were fun, but, you know, we started to build up more structured research through postgraduate students who could go out for a longer period of times. And so Sherry Mang did her PhD mostly with doing camera trapping. I just put camera traps both in the canopy, so we've got these fantastic photos of orangutan up in the canopy, and also at ground level, and just, you know, some basic biodiversity stuff that you get out of that. You know? So you find all the species that you expect to find, often in much higher densities than anyone had expected, of critically endangered species like the orangutans, but also species that we had not expected to find, like these pen-tailed tree shrew. Who knew that such a thing existed? In their distribution, their known distribution in Borneo was nowhere near this place, so it's just quite fun. And spotted giant flying squirrel. There's some really cool stuff, and this is one thing I love about going there, is that every time you come across a creature that you had no idea that such a thing existed in the world. So yeah, that's the fun bit of it. And Sherry also did some of the much more harder analysis bits, because this forest, I say, it's one type of forest. It really is lots of different types of forest in a mosaic, some wet, some dry, and it all kind of exists in this kind of mosaic in the landscape. And one of the key questions that we're interested in is whether this kind of diversity that you get of forest types, whether that's important for maintaining the biodiversity of animals, the diversity of animals you get. And so, yeah, so through the camera tapping, we found that, yeah, there is this structure in the communities of mammals in the forest that kind of follows the structure of different habitats. So if you're designing a protected area, you might want to take that into account, that you need to include these kind of different places, different types of habitat. What's really hard about studying these areas, you can only really scratch the surface a lot of the time. And so, yeah, I didn't really have any good pictures from bioacoustics. But, this is the way we're going with this, and this is really the vision of an American collaborator on this project, Wendy Earp. She had the idea of sticking these sound recorders out, passive acoustic monitors, they're called. They're basically, yeah, sound recorders. You leave them out in the forest day in, day out, and they just record, and every 10 days we go and someone goes and changes the batteries in the SD cards. And so this creates, and because lots of animals in the forest, whether they're mammals or birds or insects or reptiles, communicate using sound, because they can't see each other very well usually in a forest. So every bit of sound that these recorders pick up is a data point for us. You know, this is an observation of animal activity. But having these recorders, having multiple recorders going every day, day in, day out, it creates terabytes of data, far too much for any human being to do anything with. So our problem now is that we've got too much data and no way of dealing with it. Really, that was the problem with this. So what we soon started to develop was look at artificial intelligence to help us make sense of all of this data. And so there are two postgraduate students working on this now for the last 3.5 years, making great headway in being able to run 20,000 hours of recordings through an algorithm, and it tells you exactly where all the gibbon calls are. And we're now sort of looking at it actually telling us what kind of diversity there is and what the different composition of different places is, even if you don't know anything about what is making the calls. So this is a really exciting area, and I think this is really a game changer for studying biodiversity in these kind of inaccessible landscapes, where you can actually gather data year round, day in, day out, and data is no longer going to be the limiting factor. Analyzing the data is the limiting factor now. So this is great. So finally, I just want to briefly, I've probably been going on for far too long. We're all desperate for our canapes, right? Just want to touch on, because when you're working in a place, so we're working there in Borneo, and there's a big elephant in the room. You know, you're working on studying the biodiversity in an unprotected area, hoping that this will help get it protected. Meanwhile, already protected areas are burning down to the ground. So there's a big problem that you have to face as a conservation biologist. You can't just study the biodiversity that you love studying. You need to actually study the problems that are causing the loss of biodiversity. And so here in the south of Borneo, where the soil is made up of peat, so this is like accumulated organic matter that is built up over many thousands of years. So in areas where there has been deforestation, that peat dries out and becomes flammable, essentially. And in particularly dry seasons, this leads to fires that can spill over into forested areas and destroy more forest. And yeah, so back in 2015, was a particularly bad drought, particularly bad fire year that really prompted us to think, well, you know, we're just fiddling around at the edges here, having a lovely time. But if we want to do something about this big problem, you know, about conserving biodiversity, we have to see what we can contribute to tackling this big problem. And so this was a slide that from presentation to a grants panel for getting a grant to work on this. Yeah, it kind of summed up like some of the enormous impact of these peatland fires in 2015. So the Guardian called it the year's worst environmental disaster. For human health, there were, you know, loads of people treated for smoke-related respiratory problems, and you know, people there basically were living for months on end in dense smoke, in air quality conditions that are 1,000 times worse than what is considered, you know, hazardous, the limit of, you know. And then the carbon emissions, dwarfing the carbon emissions that come from burning fossil fuels in the UK. Now, this alone would be a really good reason for us to want to tackle this problem, right? And then there's this big loss to the Indonesian economy as well because of these fires. So there's lots of really good reasons to want to tackle this problem. And obviously the Indonesian government agrees with that as well, and they have a program to try and fix this. So the Mega Rise project, this is this area to the east of protected Savannah National Park. This is a big area that was deforested for agricultural purposes back in the 80s, 90s especially. They dug loads of canals in there, thousands of kilometers of canals. The scale of it is quite mind-boggling, which have drained the peat. The peat's dried out. It's not great farmland. It's really not working very well. But it's a tinder box in the dry season. So this is the epicenter of the problem. So this is really, and the fires from there spill out into the forest. So this is really where we're focusing our efforts. And yeah, so what we did was we got a load of people together, people from Indonesia, people that have an interest in this problem, people from governance and academics, and brought them together with academics from the UK, from all sorts of various fields. And sit around and try and figure out what are the problems, why can't we solve, what are the obstacles to solving this problem, and what are the knowledge gaps that science can address, the science in its broadest way can address to fix this problem. So that led to a paper, that led to us getting a grant to research this problem. Now, I could talk to you about this research all day long, and so I decided not to. You'll be pleased to hear. But this kind of this figure here sums it up a little bit. So we're looking at, you know, there's the drivers, the things that cause the problem. It's climate. It's the condition of it's human behaviour. It's the political systems. Then there's the impact, you know, that actually kind of make us focus, force us. Where are the problems the biggest, so where do we have to focus our remedial action the most? And then the building resilience bit of it, which includes like reforestation and re-wetting the peat, so damming those canals and re-wetting the peat. And there's an awful lot of science that happens in all of these little bits. And connecting all those dots is really what it's all about. And I think the takeaway from this is really when you want to fix these environmental problems, they're never simple. There's lots of moving parts that all affect each other again. So, yeah, sometimes I think, how did I get here from studying tiny little wasps? And sometimes I think, I wish I was still looking down my microscope at tiny little wasps. But in some ways, you know, it's not that different from looking at these food webs. You know, it's lots of different parts that affect each other through various different links. And it's a fantastic challenge And so, yeah, I mean, this project, we got about 50 people working on it, 50 Indonesians, no, sorry, half of them in Indonesia, other half here in the UK at various universities. So it's a really big team effort. At the same time, though, also we got some other funding from the Darwin Initiative, which is where, so working with the NGO Borneo Nature Foundation, where we don't just do the science around it, but we also actually do the interventions. So building dams to block canals, to do the rewetting of the peak, and reforestation projects run by local communities, and revitalizing of livelihoods with local communities. And then, you know, so, and this kind of feeds back with the science. Ideally, you know, the two talk to each other and we improve. That's the idea. It's not always easy. It doesn't always work the way we want it, but that's really where we're at now. And yeah, I think. Right. I'm going to stop. And I just want to say, all of this work has involved loads and loads of people, and I can't possibly try and mention them all because I'll forget some key people and I'll feel embarrassed. So I just say thank you to all of the people that are involved in all of this work. But some people I want to highlight is that, you know, obviously all the researchers are important, but the other people that are also really important are the people that back us up in our research services. So pleased to have some people from the finance team here, because without them, you know, none of this we'd never get our grants together. We'd never be able to manage our problems. So thank you, and glad you could make it today as well. So and you know, of course, you can't do work without also having fun on the side. And so living in Cornwall is brilliant, you know, right? Going paddling with dolphins on a regular basis, it's good for the soul. And you know, for me, even really important, playing music with people in the pub. Yeah, there's loads of people that maybe have not been in any way directly involved in the work. If they hadn't been there, and all the friends that are here, it's, you know, great to see so many friends as well from outside academia. Without all of that, I don't think I would have coped. So thank you all very much. And so finally, I mean, obviously, my family. We're very lucky to have had the opportunity to bring them out to my field sites, to my more exotic field sites. Never that interested in the soggy field in the southeast of England. They weren't born yet at that point, to be fair. But yeah, so this is Alfie and Ben in South Africa, holding up the skull of a kudu that probably died of an anthrax infection. I believe they washed their hands afterwards. They're still with us. That worked out fine. And yeah, here we are in Borneo. So they came to the tail end of an expedition. The last one I went on, I think. And here we're all staring into a bucket. I was very excited. There's a little fish in there that we just pulled out of the swamp. And as soon as I saw it, I knew that was a new species to science. So here we all are, staring down at it. And it's been confirmed now as well as definitely new to science. So yeah, this is, like I said, living the dream. Especially with my family there. So yeah, thank you very much.
Thanks so much for that, Frank. That was amazing. So Frank has, I don't know, for some reason asked me to give the vote of thanks. I'm not quite sure what that means, but I think it's because I recently basically acquired a really stupid job title, and I think that then makes me qualified to give the vote of thanks. So I guess, so first off, I mean, it's lovely to hear that kind of journey for your research, because even though I've known you for years, I just thought you did loads of random stuff. And you base your research on going to nice places, but actually there are some real, key links. And actually your contribution has been absolutely amazing, really. You've done some, I'm more familiar with your experimental work, I think, in that sense, because I'm an experimental biologist, and, you've contributed massively to our understanding of extinction cascades and network ecology. And actually I've used a lot of your research to inspire some of our work actually on the spread of antibiotic resistance. So thank you very much for that. And also,
Welcome.
thank you for your amazing applied work. It really is wonderful to actually see a scientist going from, massive conceptual breakthroughs to actually really, really trying to save the world and do something good. So again, thank you so much for that. And I guess on a slightly more personal note, I mean, as I mentioned, I've known you for, 20 years probably now, I think. Actually, it was, I was in Oxford at the time when Frank was in at Imperial, and actually I think it was through Frank sort of terrorising the home counties with his band Warblefly, which again, I think everyone was exposed to this at some point. But I think as a consequence, knowing Frank and then Frank moving down here, then it was only about 2 years later where I think, probably Frank's presence was one of the sort of tipping points that inspired me to come down here as well. So again, and that had a massively positive impact on my life. So yeah, thank you very much. And I'll leave it there. But I guess